The following is something Conan wanted to do. He will make more whenever time and fate allow. He apologizes to Charlie Rose for stealing his set.
Hey there, I'm Conan O'Brien. Welcome to Serious Jibber-Jabber. I'm here with Pulitzer Prize-winning author Edmund Morris, who spent over 30 years writing 3 books about the life of Theodore Roosevelt, as well as the biography of Ronald Reagan, Dutch. Edmund, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you, Conan.
You know, one of the reasons I wanted to do this, particularly with you, is because I had you on the late night program. I think we had all of 7 minutes to talk. You left, and I thought, I want to talk to that man for a long time, probably longer than you want to talk to me, so I was very happy that you could be here.
Well, as I recall, I had 1 minute and you had 5, so I remember leaving the set wanting to talk to you too.
Yes. Well, today I'm also going to dominate the conversation. That's what I do. You don't know much about me. I've been a lifelong presidential history buff. Always been fascinated with American presidents, but Teddy Roosevelt eluded me until your book started to come out, and I was introduced to him. So maybe you could tell me, why did you choose Teddy Roosevelt? What grabbed you about TR?
He eluded me too, in a way, because I became conscious of him, aware of him when I was a boy of about 10, living in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya. And I, for some reason, was looking through a history book about the city, which was only 50 years old. And there was a photograph of this famous former American president who'd come to Kenya on a major safari in 1910. And he wore a pith helmet, and he had these big teeth and a mustache, and something about the face of Theodore Roosevelt appealed to me as a boy, and I just thought it would be fun to be with him.
Yeah, there was something
I forgot about that image for 25 years.
Really? Because he's I think I've had this thought before, that the great presidents are easily caricatured. Do you know that they look, there's something about them that's easy to capture, and Teddy Roosevelt, probably one of the most famous caricatures that we've ever had in U.S. history.
If you wanted to get a letter to him, you would just draw some teeth and spectacles on an envelope, and the post office would deliver it.
Would they really? I get that. People just draw hair, and it shows up. This is one of the things that brought him back to me, and it happened around the time that your first book came out. Living on the Upper West Side, I used to pass the Natural History Museum all the time. And I would pass the statue, and it says at the base of the statue, I remembered stopping and looking at this: author, statesman, scholar, humanitarian, historian, patriot, ranchman, conservationist, explorer, naturalist, scientist, and soldier. I remember having the thought, that can't be possible. He could not have done all those things, and he did. Could we have a president like that again?
I think not. My wife always says his secret was servants, but nevertheless, to pack all that into 60 years, plus be President of the United States for almost 8 of them, is phenomenal. And his secret, insofar as it could be explained, was simply that he moved and thought so fast. He read so fast. He read 3 pages a minute, photographing each page as he read. His desk was clear of all his work by lunchtime when he was president. He just was a very fast person.
He also, I mean, keep in mind, he's reading in different languages too. How many languages?
He read in Italian. He couldn't speak Italian, but he read French and German fluently and spoke them pretty damn well. And, of course, English.
And, you know, what's incredible about him is, okay, you brought up he's moving fast. This is the impression I had when I read your 3 volumes. I sensed it a little bit in the first 2. When I get to the later stage of his life, it was a greater impression that I had, is that today we'd call him manic. You'd almost want, you read about him and you think, this is a man that almost probably today someone would medicate him. Because there seems to be, there's a rush to action that at times feels almost borderline psychotic. Is that
yes,
that
but when
fair?
you're in the presence of a person like that who is manic, one tends to become very edgy. And there is no testimony by anybody that being with him was enervating. There was a sort of calm about him, oddly enough, even though he was such a bundle of energy. When he listened to you, when you were talking to him, for example, he was cataleptically still. He concentrated enormously. And his sentences, when he wrote, were carefully thought out and composed. There was no undue rush about him, no hysteria. He was a calm man who just happened to think and move 5 times as fast as normal human beings.
Would you, I think you've said this before, that you're not sure that you'd enjoy a conversation with Teddy Roosevelt or look forward to a conversation with Teddy Roosevelt. Is that true? As a conversationalist, do you think he'd be an easy person to talk to?
No, like all presidents, he was overbearingly concerned with dominating the conversation. So if you spent the evening with him, you would just have to accept the fact that he was going to talk and talk and talk and talk and use this first-person pronoun which he loved so much. I, me. But he was, fortunately, unlike many overbearing presidents, a charming man, and his stories were so funny and his perceptions were so acute that it was a treat to listen to him.
Now, we talked about this a little off camera, but I wanted to bring it up here. I love to go to historical presidential sites. I love to visit presidential homes. And I think one of the best, easily, might be TR's home in Oyster Bay. And I was struck by the fact, as you describe it in your book, that he saw this property when he was younger and just said, I'd like to have that. And he fortunately had the resources to do it. But then he constructs, at still a very young age, this massive home, as if he knew that he had to build himself a giant house. It's like an act of will to build a house like that.
Yeah, 22 rooms just after he got married to his young wife, straight out of Harvard. He, as you say, he just knew that he was going to amount to something enormous. It was apparent even long before that in his letters, his teenage letters to his sisters, for example. Whenever he got onto some public subject in the letter, he knew posterity would be reading this letter, and he would sign the letter, Theodore Roosevelt, to his sisters, who knew very well.
Right.
Normally he would call himself Thee or Teddy. But those posterity letters he was writing even in his teens.
So he's writing with the idea that this is going to be important for history, even when he's a teenager.
When I was researching his first honeymoon, he married this gorgeous Boston girl, Alice Hathaway Lee.
Mm-hmm.
He kept a personal diary in those days at Harvard, documenting every day of their relationship. So naturally, I was very interested to know what it was going to be like when he finally married Alice and took her to Springfield and got into bed with her. I hope that it would
You sound very creepy, by the way, talking about this.
Biographers are weird people. We
Okay.
have to accept that.
So, yeah. So you're exploring his sex life.
So I was hoping to hear what it was like in bed with Alice Lee, and I turned the page of the diary. He says, our sacred happiness. Our happiness is too sacred to be written about. And that was it. And I got the distinct feeling reading this, that he, in 1882, was talking to me, Mr. Future Biographer.
Right.
This is private. Stay out of this one night.
Right.
So he was conscious even then that one day some beady-eyed historian was going to be going through his books.
Talking to a beady-eyed talk show host about it in a dark room, like two creeps. So he knows. You had said before we started taping that it's Jeffersonian too. Jefferson has to build himself a big house on a hill. There's a certain there's a similarity there in these men that seem to think, I need this. I need this almost. I need a box this big to contain my great personality.
True. Washington too, George Washington at Mount Vernon. I don't know what it is, but that's...
Lyndon Johnson, his ranch is very much don't you think, a little bit of a statement of...
I've not seen it. Is it like that?
It is. It's like very much, and he was important for him to have statesmen come and see him at the ranch. People needed to come to his ranch. It's you get a sense of his personality when you go there.
Yeah. Ronald Reagan, in contrast, was not like that.
Mm-mm.
He was a very strange combination of an enormous id. He knew his identity. He knew his purpose. He knew what he wanted out of his life, what he wanted to achieve with the United States, but he had no personal ego. Had id, but no ego. He had no desire to live in splendid premises, to impress people. He wasn't particularly interested in credit for what he did. His idea of paradise was this dinky little ranch up in the mountains above Santa Barbara, which is the most squalid little shack you ever saw.
It's not impressive at all?
No, he put it together himself. It's got pictures hanging crooked on the wall and a yellow shag rug covering the toilet seat and dead flies hanging from the fly paper at the table outside, and he thought it was paradise.
You know, it's funny because you get the impression of it, talking about Reagan, that contrasting him with Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is very outgoing. Reagan, I think there are a lot of people who think of him that way, but he was not, in that sense, really outgoing, was he?
No, he was a very aloof person in private. In fact, in private, he was not really there. One just had the feeling that he was needing to get back onto some stage and perform. And as soon as he did, he became magical and big and authoritative. But in private, Reagan was dull, hollow.
Did you ever have I can't say if it's hundreds of hours, but in all the amount of time that you spent with President Reagan, was there ever a moment that you had with him, a private moment that told you a lot about him, that really illustrated something about him that would help the rest of us key into him as a person?
Well, once in the Oval Office, I asked him about his youth in Des Moines when he was a young sportscaster.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I was thinking about sex. I said to him, Mr. President, what sort of things do you do at night when you were a young man in Des Moines? I was hoping he was going to tell me about his girlfriends. Mm-hmm. I knew he had a gorgeous girlfriend from Drake University. He said, I used to go to the advertising club. I said, really? Why? He said, well, we had the best speakers from out of town. They all came to the advertising club, and I learned a lot about public speaking, listening to those men. He said, I remember one guy who came, and we thought he was the president of a toilet paper manufacturing company. And he gave this speech about the manufacture of toilet paper, and we were laughing fit to bust. Oh, that was so funny. So I said, so he was a comedian, was he? He said, oh, yes, it was a put-on job, but I can remember that speech to this day, says the President of the United States in the Oval Office. So I said, well, can you remember any of it now? And at which his eyes went opaque, his voice changed, and for the next 8 minutes, he disgorged the speech in a voice that was not Ronald Reagan's voice. He was possessed by the memory of this man that he heard, telling this endless, not very funny anecdote in 1933.
And he knows it word for word.
It came out, it was like a recording mechanism. And when he finally was through, I said, Mr. President, did he give you the script? Did you memorize this from the script? He said, no, I haven't thought about it until today.
And what does that tell you?
Well, it told me that he was by nature thespian. He was a recording mechanism. He was not a great actor, as we all know, watching his movies, but he was a great actor as president. And his nature was to perform, to learn, to articulate words that were put into him. It was a really creepy moment, but at the same time revelatory.
You know, what's interesting is that, because we're talking about these two presidents and their similarities and their differences, but, Theodore Roosevelt, before he was president, people feared if this guy becomes president, because he had this kind of bellicose, warlike image, we're going to all be in trouble. He could be dangerous. People thought of him as, this could be a dangerous person. The same thing I remembered when I was a teenager and Ronald Reagan's running for the presidency, and a lot of people are talking about, we can't have this guy's finger on the button. This is going to be a real problem. He's, it's dangerous. There was this, both statesmen, when they become president, are actually quite diplomatic. They're sparing in their use of force, and they're not afraid to use diplomacy, and they're quite sophisticated about it.
You're absolutely right.
Which seemed like actually kind of a shocking surprise to a lot of people.
Well, it's the effect of the office. The office does change a man. They suddenly become aware of the fact that they have to be statesmen, that they represent the United States. And in TR's case, his natural bellicosity smoothed out. He became diplomatic and thoughtful and civilized. In Reagan's case, he again became, his religious faith came out very strongly. He began to realize that a man in control of the country's nuclear policy has to have moral considerations weighing upon him all the time. So he too became statesmanlike and charitably inclined. It's the effect of great power.
So the office changes
Democratic power.
Right, well, the office changes them. Then you also get the sense, and this is really true with Teddy Roosevelt, he gives up the office. It's one of the strangest things, very hard to understand, but in 1908, he can run again, and he doesn't. He pretty much hands the office over to someone who secretly he probably believes is not up to the office, is not of his stature, Taft. And he hands the office over, and they're friends. And very quickly, you can tell it eats away at him, and he regrets it. And you almost feel like that's someone who, once he had the presidency, he couldn't handle, he had a very difficult time not being president.
Yes, I thought it was a statesman-like act to give up the presidency when he could have had a third term, or for that matter, a fourth,
Right.
in those days, on a platter. But he felt that almost 8 years in power were enough, and he felt that power should be given back to the people. So it was a statesman-like act to give it up. But as you say, once he gave it up, since his nature was to be presidential, he kind of regretted the power that he'd lost and wanted it back. Not immediately. He did think that President Taft, his hand-picked successor, would carry on his policies, particularly his conservation policies. And it was only when he came back from his marathon, year-long safari in Africa in 1910 that he realized that President Taft was perverting his record. And that's when he began to hanker to get the White House back.
What's interesting to me is when he wants the White House back and eventually decides to run against Taft, it is nasty. You know, people love to talk about how the rhetoric in the United States today, it's sunk to a new low, and they forget that we've been here before. But Teddy Roosevelt fighting Taft for the nomination, eventually making his own party, it's brutal, isn't it?
Yes, I think that campaigning transforms a man just as becoming president transforms a man. In this case, once a man is campaigning, he becomes a visceral animal. Aggression begins to become a large part of it. Mm-hmm. And even although TR and Taft were sweetly disposed to each other when TR was president, the fact that they were fighting each other for the presidency in 1912 made the fight vicious. Even Taft, who was the most gentle, benign person, became shrewish and unpleasantly aggressive. It's the, I suppose, the adrenaline of campaigning. I remember interviewing Jimmy Carter after he left the presidency. In fact, he was asking me and a few other historians for advice as to how to write his memoirs, as he pronounced it. Mm-hmm. And I said, Mr. President, you know, what I think you could do to begin them is have a prologue describing that magical day when you became president and you and Rosalind Carter, your wife, got out of the limo coming down from Capitol Hill. The sun was shining, and after all the claustrophobia and the insecurity of the Nixon years and the Ford years, here was the new president of the United States walking along hand in hand with his wife in the bright sunshine. I said, that was a great moment. And if you made a prologue describing that moment, and then you could write the rest of the book as the story of how you got to that time. And he said, no, I'm going to start with the night I triumphed over Scoop Jackson in the Florida primary.
Yeah.
And his eyes flashed. And I realized that was the most cathartic moment in his life. The Florida primary, when he shafted Scoop Jackson and became the likely next president.
Well, you know, it's hard to imagine any modern president, or probably any president in history, who doesn't have that. You have to have that killer instinct. Mm-hmm. And the disconnect a little bit is we tend to elevate these people. We put them on Mount Rushmore. We build monuments to them. a good politician needs to be, as you said, it's a political animal.
Yeah.
Has to be vicious, and so the Federalists, that's incredibly nasty stuff. Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. I mean, people think that politics in America got nastier, and I always think, I don't know that it did. It's become, the tools are different now, but you read some of those broadsides from the 1790s, the early 19th century, or Civil War. I mean, it's always been vicious.
You're right.
It's incredibly vicious.
And the chagrin of losing, too, is acute. The sting of presidential defeat, even if you're somebody as unambitious as Gerald Ford, when he was beaten for a re-election, he couldn't get over it for years.
Yeah.
I remember Carter saying to me that although he recovered from defeat, he said, Rosalind will never be the same.
Really? Mm-hmm. So she's, in a way, you get this a little bit of the same sense with the first president, George Bush, that his loss to Clinton.
That's right. That's another example.
There was a documentary recently. It's very, very reverential towards George Bush. And there's one sour note that I saw in the entire documentary, which is when they asked him about Ross Perot. And he's been so charming and so nice and so even-handed about everything. They asked him about Ross Perot. He said, I'm not going to talk about him. He cost me the election. I don't like him. I'm not going to talk about him.
Yeah.
And everything else had been, I love being up in Maine. Life is good.
Then suddenly, boom, this hidden aggression comes out. Yeah.
And you say losing that office is something that people have
and
a hard
been
time.
challenged for it too. That they can never forgive either. Reagan was the sweetest man. He found it very difficult to say, or for that matter, think anything negative about anybody. But he was strangely savage whenever he talked about his predecessors.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. He said of Jimmy Carter, he said, that man, he was the only guy who ever came into the White House and left it a smaller man than when he came in. And he was contemptuous of Jerry Ford. He said he wasn't elected to anything. He was not legitimate. And I said, what about LBJ? He said, do you know that LBJ used to say after he left the White House that there never was a night that he went to sleep without worrying that World War III would begin while he was asleep? He said, how can a president have that sort of moral cowardice and fear the start of a war when he's in office? So he was oddly vituperative toward his predecessors, particularly those who'd run against him.
It makes me think of an actor thinking about the person who played the role before them.
Yeah.
And being contemptuous. A really good actor, Sir Laurence Olivier, is not interested in watching someone else's Hamlet. Mm-hmm. And so that's, to me, it says a lot about the actor, Ronald Reagan.
Yes, the possessiveness of the part.
This is my part. This is the part I play, and it can't be played any other way. Of the 3 books that you wrote on Teddy Roosevelt, it's the third that obviously there's a lot of melancholy in the third, in my opinion, because he's struggling so much to figure out, to find his place, and he wants to run again. And I think the saddest chapter in his life at that point is the loss of his son. He loses his son in World War I, and I imagine there must be an incredible amount of guilt. It's not something people didn't go to. He'd never have gone to a therapist or a psychiatrist. There was no such thing as being introspective that way. But he loses his son in a war that he championed. And he very much wanted to fight in that war, Teddy Roosevelt, but wasn't allowed to. He encourages all his sons to go off, and his son Quentin's killed. Was there guilt there, do you think?
Yes, I think so. Quentin, of course, was the youngest and the brightest of the children, the one most like himself. He was, in fact, illegally young to have gone off to war, but of course he had to be the one who was killed. And his death in July of 1918 hit TR with such cosmic force that he never recovered from it. At once, for the first time in his life, he realized what war really was. He'd romanticized it so much up to that point. Ever since he was a boy himself, he'd imagined that war was glorious and romantic, and his own experience of war in the Spanish-American War, when he charged up San Juan Hill, had been ecstatic. But he didn't realize that war by then had become mechanized and brutal, and fascism was incipient in the German campaign. And when this machine, this war machine, shot down his only son, his youngest son.
Who was a pilot.
Who was a pilot. Yeah. And he saw that photograph that I reproduced in the book of this dead boy lying by the broken plane.
The Germans took a photograph of him, laid him out, and put him next to the wreckage of the plane and took a photo.
He looked like a steer fallen off a hook. I think the impact of that was so great that TR never recovered psychologically. And in fact, he died just
6 months later. A few months later,
yeah.
He dies.
Yeah.
And it's fashionable now for people to psychoanalyze, and it's hard not to in the world we live in today, but you think sometimes that we've learned so much now about not acknowledging guilt, not acknowledging certain emotions, and how that can prey upon you. And you think about someone like Teddy Roosevelt, who outlives his father, died at a young age, and loses his wife and loses his first daughter and then loses his son, that there might be a lot of unacknowledged feelings there. And when someone's just not introspective and pushing forward, that might have an effect on them.
Guilt, probably, that he didn't fully understand himself. He was of that Victorian ilk that believed that strong emotions should be suppressed. For example, that beautiful young wife I was talking about earlier on, Alice Lee, died after only 4 years of marriage, died having just given birth to their daughter Alice. And in the same house on the same night, T.R.'s mother died. So these two women died on him
Right.
almost simultaneously. And the shock of Alice's death was so great upon him that for the rest of his life he never mentioned her name. He didn't even talk about her to their child, Alice. He refused to even mention her in his autobiography. It was like he just wanted to suppress, eradicate, expunge the memory. That was a very Victorian thing to do.
And what does he say in the diary that he keeps that day? He's right. There's a sentence that's not coming to mind right now. You'll know it, but he has a line that he writes in his diary the day that he loses his wife and his daughter.
The light has gone out of my life.
Yeah.
And he wrote a big cross. So if you suppress grief that in so extreme a fashion, it's obviously going to create suppressed unhappiness and trauma later on in life, which I think explains why he was so melancholy in his last years.
And what about Reagan, again, a famously difficult person to psychoanalyze, but the child of an alcoholic, and maybe not an accident that he became very adept at. If he saw these painful things when he was a child, it's a classic transformation to make yourself somebody who can maybe become other people. The
strange thing about Reagan was when he was a young star in Hollywood, he hung out with Humphrey Bogart and Pat O'Brien and all these boozy stars. He would go out drinking with them. He would nurse a beer right through the night, and they would be drinking. Spencer Tracy was another. They'd be drinking to the point of vomiting, and he would take them home and put them to bed. So alcohol had no terrors for him. He could live with it, unlike the children of many alcoholics. His suppressions were more primary. For example, he had a child that he never talked about, who was born to his wife Jane Wyman in 1948, the worst year of his life. And this child was born, she had a name, Christine, and she died after only about 24 hours of life. He could not bring himself ever to acknowledge her existence, even when I tried to talk to him about it. When his mother and...
When you ask him, would he'd say, I don't want to discuss it, or he would say absolutely nothing?
He was a past master at changing the subject. He would evade. He would just get out of it, slip out of it. And of course, it was very difficult for me to touch on things like that with him. One of the unpleasant aspects of biography is that you do, if your subject is still alive, have to deal with primary things, and often it's so painful for them that one shrinks from doing it.
And his first marriage not working out was...
He would never talk about that marriage, no. Because Jane divorced him because she found him boring.
And that was also the nadir of his career, wasn't it?
Yeah, his career was collapsing at the same time. But to be an actor, to be a thespian, to be told by your wife that you're boring it's like a spear into the stomach.
I know. Trust me, I know.
I got that out of him.
Yeah, very good. This relates to Teddy Roosevelt. Had he lived and run in 1920, a lot of people think that he'd have walked away, he'd have won easily. Do you believe that?
It's more or less certain that he would have, because there was a Republican landslide that year. Warren Harding was elected. And TR was the favourite for the nomination. If he hadn't died, he would have been the nominee. There's no question about it at all, and he would have been elected.
You probably can't even calculate how many things that changes if Teddy Roosevelt is president again in 1920 and not Warren Harding, who is a huge disappointment.
Except I think that leaders die when they have to die. They usually die at the appropriate moment. He died when he should have. The war had come to an end. He'd suffered this tragedy, and the values that he stood for, the gentlemanly values of the 19th century, had become passé overnight. Mm-hmm. So he would have had to deal with the jazz age,
right,
and the age of relativity and galloping science and eugenics and all these things. And I don't think, with his sensibility, he could have handled it.
No, he couldn't be an anachronism.
Yeah.
Didn't want to be in it. No one does, but he can't exist that way.
Mm.
Why did he hate Woodrow Wilson so much? Woodrow Wilson's a progressive. Woodrow Wilson interested in enacting a lot of the same things that Teddy Roosevelt's interested in. Why did he despise him so much?
Not at first. He liked Wilson when he was president, as he liked everybody. But, and in fact, up until 1911, he still got on pretty well with Wilson whenever they met. Wilson was more cagey. Wilson was not too pleased with Theodore Roosevelt. But when they campaigned against each other in 1912, again, the adrenaline of campaigning turned it into a fight. And Wilson was a superb, cool campaigner. He knew exactly what kind of rhetoric to use to get TR crazy with resentment. Mm-hmm. And the fact that he won, of course, was salt in TR's wounds. And the fact that he was president when the war broke out in 1914 and Theodore Roosevelt was not, this parochial Presbyterian intellectual was in the White House, a man with very little foreign knowledge, very little understanding of diplomacy and foreign cultures. It just drove TR crazy because he knew that he should be in there and handling these matters himself.
And Woodrow Wilson's working hard, or says, I'm going to keep us out of this war, and that's Teddy Roosevelt wants us in.
And Woodrow Wilson at first was a pacifist, yes, saying we have no place in this war and Americans want to be kept out of it. I always think, although I hesitate to speculate about what would have happened, that kind of thinking is usually specious, but it is a fact that Theodore Roosevelt in 1914, if he had been president when the war broke out, was a man of proven diplomatic virtuosity. He had the Nobel Peace Prize for settling the Russo-Japanese War in 1906. He had this enormous circle of European acquaintance. He knew all those emperors. He knew them personally. He'd stayed in their palaces. He corresponded with them. He spoke their languages. He understood their culture. He was a gifted diplomat. And the only president who's ever been called upon to mediate a foreign war. So in 1914, if he'd been in the White House, he would have been superbly equipped to to mediate a settlement amongst those warring powers. It was quite apparent by early 1915 that all the imperial powers at war with one another did want a way out. And if TR had been there, he probably would have been able to bring the war to a much...
It was just about saving face,
conclusion.
They all knew pretty quickly, after the Schlieffen Plan doesn't work, they know this is awful, or this trench warfare is horrible, and then they're committed to it for a long time. So that's amazing. Roosevelt is a Republican. He's one of the most famous of the Republicans. But you look at the Republican Party today, and you look at Teddy Roosevelt, and you see he's a trust buster. He's really almost fanatically interested in reining in business. How does that fit today with the Republican Party?
Not at all. I think he'd be a big government Democrat if he was alive now.
Do you think that the Republicans then are hesitant to, pose with statues of Teddy Roosevelt for that reason, or not? Do they recognize the disconnect between what his republicanism was like versus theirs?
Well, of course, most of them don't know anything about him.
Right.
I mean, the kind of people we have running for office these days have no historical memory and very little culture. So Republicans tend to identify with TR, and for that matter with Ronald Reagan, simply because they know that these men were Republicans and were fabulously successful in their time. And that's all they know.
Right.
They really studied the intricacies of TR's social attitudes. They wouldn't want to identify with him at all.
Do you think of Teddy Roosevelt as a racially progressive president?
For his time, he was relatively enlightened. He was a patronizing upper-class WASP gentleman. But he did sincerely believe, and within a few weeks of becoming president, proved that he admired any black man who could make it in Whitey's world, which is why he gave that famous dinner to Booker T. Washington in October of 1901.
He got a lot
just
of
weeks
criticism.
after coming to the White House.
A lot of criticism.
First time a black man had ever sat down with the President of the United States in the White House, with his wife and daughter around the same table. And the explosion of racial paranoia in the South amongst the white democratic South was quite phenomenal. And although TR felt he'd made a moral point, saying it felt entirely natural for me to be having dinner with Dr. Washington, he never invited him back.
Right. Well, there's a lot of, throughout history, even John F. Kennedy is walking a line in his presidency on civil rights. He's very aware that he very narrowly won. It was the closest election up to that point. Mm-hmm. And so he's pragmatic. We're talking about pragmatic people. And they have, I'm sure, a moral conscience, but they're also pragmatists, and they're of their time.
Yeah. By modern terms, TR would routinely be described as a patronizing racist, as everybody of his class was in those days. Mm-hmm. But in terms of his own time, he was comparatively enlightened. President Taft, for example, made a declaration as soon as he became president: I will have no black office holders. And Woodrow Wilson was worse than any of them.
Right.
He was an out-and-out Southern racist. TR was quite happy to have black men at his table and come and spend the night in his house. And, but they had to be educated, gentlemanly, self-proven, self-developed individuals. For the general mass of black Americans, he had very little compassion.
Americans seem to like, or were very comfortable with, often, with presidents that come from affluence, especially in times of stress. And I'm thinking about, you contrast FDR with Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover's completely self-made. He really is probably the icon of what should be the hero for the Depression. But people are more comfortable with Franklin Roosevelt, who, of course, grew up absurdly wealthy. Mm-hmm. You look at Nixon, completely self-made, and comes from a poor family and has to make it all on his own, which might fuel his paranoia, as opposed to Kennedy, who, is quite wealthy, extremely wealthy, and seems more comfortable. Is there anything to that thought?
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear you say that. I've not thought of that before, but you're right. However, it does seem that there's a prejudice against great wealth now.
Yeah.
Romney is routinely despised because he's so wealthy. Mm-hmm. And perhaps it's because presidential candidates these days have to pretend that they're not wealthy, to have to pretend that money doesn't matter to them, whereas actually it matters more than ever. Late the lead article in the New York Times about 10 days ago was the fact that President Obama has raised more money in the last month than George Romney has, than
Mitt Romney.
Mitt Romney. It's all become a matter of money. And I guess we, as Americans, admire and revere money, but we've gotten to the point we don't like rich men to run for office. In the past, it was not a problem. I think Americans perhaps felt that money made candidates, inherited money, made them objective and unprejudiced and patrician and well-bred.
Well, even, Lincoln's a very successful, today we'd think of him as a corporate lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
He's very successful, and he obviously came from great poverty, but he had amassed, not a fortune, but he had made a very good life for himself.
Yeah, right.
And today, that was something that they didn't give people a hard time for that throughout a lot of them. JFK got some flack for it, but not nearly what happens today.
Well, JFK had the way of joking about his status, and he had that delicious humor. Presidential candidates these days are so solemn and serious and afraid of self-deprecating wit.
Yeah.
If Romney would only joke about his money and just toss it,
the whole thing would go away.
I'm a rich guy, so what's the big deal?
Yeah.
It would go away.
No, JFK routinely made jokes about his father running things or his wealth, and I think now it's a soundbite culture. If you can take a soundbite, even if it's self-deprecating, we're starting to, I think, steam the irony out of American political life. You can't have any.
Oh, irony is a no-no. Yes,
yeah.
You cannot be ironic.
And it's more fun when you can, I think. The last thing I just wanted to mention was the biggest disconnect with me, or I think for a lot of probably young people today, and Teddy Roosevelt, is most pictures they see of him, he's standing over a dead, rare animal. And what is it? The man obviously was a naturalist and is responsible for really beginning the conservation movement in the United States. And didn't he see the irony of killing so many animals? Or was it just the time and they didn't think of it? They thought there's an inexhaustible supply of white rhinos.
It was the time, it was the culture. Well-born gentlemen killed large animals on both sides of the Atlantic. And in fact, those from the other side of the Atlantic were a lot worse than Americans were. These British aristocrats used to come over here and slaughter thousands at a time. T.R. sat down to dinner with the Emperor of Austria in 1910. And this is after a safari in which he'd collected something like 267 specimens in Africa. But the emperor said to him, I have killed 50,000 animals in my life. So comparatively speaking, he was not all that bloodthirsty, and he did shoot many of his expeditions were scientific. He was a passionate.
He's shipping things off to the Smithsonian. Yeah.
They still have crates at the Smithsonian full of specimens they haven't yet opened from that safari in 1910. And on a more profound level, he loved animals so much, and his curiosity about them, curiosity being a large part of love, was so intense right from childhood, that to kill them was the form of ultimate knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why he became so strangely possessed whenever he did kill a large animal. He would scream and jump and sing and become almost primeval in his reactions. He had gained knowledge of the great beast.
Right. It sounds like almost like a Native American spiritual tradition. The beast is becoming part of me. It's funny, I've been to Hyde Park, and you see this incredible collection of Franklin Roosevelt's birds that he was interested in birds, and he collected them when he was young, and you're looking at them and you realize he was fascinated. He killed them all, which is very strange. Birders today, my father loves watching birds. The idea that you'd kill one to look at it is very odd.
And then stuff them.
Stuff it and put it up on the wall. We have a web question, if that's okay. And this is from Margie from Facebook. Why didn't Teddy Roosevelt run for re-election as a Democrat instead of taking the third-party route, which was so destructive?
Oh, he wouldn't have dreamed of it. He thought of himself as a career Republican. The Republican Party, we must remember, in those days was the party of the black man.
Mm-hmm.
He once said, addressing a black audience, he said, I am pleased to address any black audience because I know that I'm addressing an audience of Republicans. And the Democratic Party, in contrast, was strictly racist. So it was inconceivable that TR at any point in his life could have become a Democrat.
So the Bull Moose part, the third party, was really his only alternative at that point.
Mm-hmm. The Progressive Party, yeah. He felt it represented the liberal wing of the Republican Party, and that was the way he felt the party should go.
All right. Well, I think I've exhausted most of my questions. I hope I haven't wasted your time.
You've exhausted me.
Yeah. This was fantastic. This is actually my dream job is to sit and get to talk to people like you. I've absolutely loved your work. What are you working on now?
Thomas Edison.
Really?
No more presidents, but Edison fascinates the hell out of me.
Why? What brought you to Edison?
Well, it's his imaginative side, oddly enough. He was a man of science who invented, patented 1,092 inventions, but all his inventions came out of imagination, out of inspiration. He was, and that's the mystery that appeals to me. How is it that technical things can come out of an almost poetic imagination?
Are you liking him as you study him more and more?
Mm-hmm. I never fall in love with my subjects, but they have to interest me obsessively, which this guy does.
When can I read that book?
I think it'll take another 2 or 3 years before I'm through.
Can I come by the house? Just check over the notes?
Sure.
I know where you live. I know that area of Connecticut.
Yeah?
I'll come by.
Okay, I'll play you my Edison phonograph.
Do you have recording of his voice?
Oh, yes. Those cylinders are amazingly vivid.
Yeah.
If you unspool them now, the sound quality is astonishingly vivid.
It's, Mary Had a Little Lamb?
That's what he recorded on his first cylinder, yeah. The irony there is that he was a deaf man right through his life. I seem to specialize in deaf guys. Beethoven, Ronald Reagan, Edison.
Keep going. Cannot thank you enough for doing this. This is an incredible pleasure. Thanks for being here.
Conan.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's it for Jibber-Jabber. My thanks to Edmund Morris for this absolute treat for me, and we'll see you next time.